So it's my great pleasure this evening to welcome our guest speakers and to welcome Lord Daniel Finkelstein and Lord Ian Blair. It's a great pleasure to have you at any point, but particularly today when there are elections happening across Britain. We have local elections and also the elections to the devolved authorities. So it's great to have you here. Thank you for joining us at Kellogg College. I'm not going to spend too long introducing you both, both very familiar faces for anybody who follows British politics or British intellectual public life. Lord Finkelstein is a prolific writer, working as both an associate editor and a weekly columnist for the Times newspaper, and has been nominated Political Commentator of the Year on 4 occasions, has been a member of the House of Lords since 2013, and has advised many prominent Conservative Party ministers. And he's joined by Lord Ian Blair, the former Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, who joined the force in 1974. His career included some of the most high-profile operations of his generation and rapid changes in institutional systems and policing policy. He's now a writer and a consultant on strategic policing, leadership and security. So we give you a virtual applause and welcome you. And our 2 guests are going to have a conversation, and then we will follow with questions, which you are very welcome to place in the chat, or you can turn on your camera and ask your question yourself at the end, and I'll just be moderating those questions. So over to you both.
Okay, Yasmin, thank you very much indeed. Danny, you and I have had quite a lot of conversations over the years. I want to start by considering the subject of moderation, because you have a book called Moderation in All Things, which is your choice of your most interesting columns from the Times, which Yasmin just mentioned. And it seems to me that moderation is in rather short supply at the present time. And I think our conversation will confirm that. But I want to just mention one of your articles from the actual book itself, which is called "No, I Won't Be Asking for a Foreign Passport," which was written in 2018, obviously after Brexit, and it's about the background of both you and your wife. So you didn't decide to want a foreign passport, but your wife did. I'm not going to ask you to comment on what your wife did, but tell us a little bit about why you didn't.
Yeah, well, first of all, Ian, thank you very much. And one of the privileges of being in the House of Lords is you get to meet some amazing people that you might not otherwise have got to know. And you are certainly very high on that list of people I'm really glad to have encountered and learned from. The best way of starting this is to explain my background a little bit. I'm a son of 2 refugees. My father was born in Poland, what's now the Ukraine actually, but was Poland when he was born there. My mother in Berlin, and her childhood was in Holland. And both of them were in captivity at one point during the war. And my father spent time on a state collective farm in Kazakhstan, Siberia. My mother in Belsen concentration camp. And both of them were children of people who were nationalists and integrationists in their countries. So they wanted to assert their Jewish identity, but they believed very strongly in trying to create a multi-ethnic society in which they could play a full part. And I was really interested in that because I think I've inherited their sensibility. I feel very strongly that taking a passport to a country is not simply a transaction. My wife just feels differently about this. She thinks herself as being more pragmatic and maybe I'm too romantic. But I think the commitment you make when you take a passport is to the other members of the community. You're accepting the rights of citizenship. You're accepting the duties of citizenship. You're accepting your identity in the collective. You're not merely an individual, and that's a very serious step to take. And I didn't feel comfortable about offering that sort of the loyalty that I feel accepting a passport implies to more than one place. there's a counter to this. The romantic view of my grandparents about the countries in which they lived proved mistaken, actually, or at least they were disappointed in their hopes. My wife says, well, maybe a more transactional view would have been more satisfactory, and certainly it was the case that a pretty much fake passport was actually the route by which my mother eventually escaped Belsen with her life.
Well, that's an extraordinary story. One of the reasons I like this particular chapter was you talked about the fact that when you were little, you suffered from asthma and your mum used to read to you in bed. And one of the books you liked was A History of the Kings and Queens of England. And I said to you the other day when we were talking about this, I bet that's our island story, which is, to say the least, a rather selective view of British history. Yes. and I read it the same. So yeah. Anyway, look, let's move on from that point to, as it were, what's happening to moderation. I was listening this morning to Anthony Blinken, the new Secretary of State in the United States, talking on Radio 4 about the G7 meeting. And I just want to know how you see what's going to happen about the sort of clash of the rise of authoritarian leaders like Erdogan and Modi, or authoritarian countries like Russia and China. How does that, do you think that the rules-based international world can return?
So I would have, 10 years ago when it was my birthday, and I was giving a little speech to my guests to bore them after I cut the cake. I said, the one thing that I felt was at the age of 50 that I'd never had to suffer what my parents suffered, and I never would. And I'm not sure I'd make the same speech today, Ian, for the reasons that you just alluded to. I think that being complacent about the continuation of liberal democracy, of pluralist institutions, of the rule of law, feeling that no arguments could undermine them. Well, the experience of the last 5 to 10 years is quite sobering. I particularly think that was the case with Donald Trump's election as president of the United States, but all the examples you give go as well. It has never been the case, obviously, that the rule of law has won its way through. So Tony Blinken is very much a sort of child of the Nuremberg. Even his stepfather was a Holocaust survivor. He's very much a child of the kind of Nuremberg trial era. That is to say, the era that suggested we could move to a situation where we had international rules and international law. But if you look at Nuremberg closely, truthfully, it was victor's justice, and there were quite a lot of people who didn't buy into it. The Soviets were never prosecuted at Nuremberg, despite the fact that they committed all the offences for which the Nuremberg defendants were found guilty. So it's never been the case that we've had a world order based on liberal rules. But what I worry about is the potential for collapse in the Western liberal order and in our own self-confidence about it. That politicians begin to know enough about voter behaviour that they realise there's lots of process things that voters don't care about, but that really, really matter. And we can see those the whole time. And it's just, particularly, I think, sobering for me as a Conservative to worry about whether the Conservative Party still understands the importance of a rules-based order.
Well, I think we'll eventually come to that conversation a bit later on. But what do you see? Blinken's arrival here as Biden's representative. From the first moment, he started to talk about the special relationship between the US and the UK, which I always find is what American politicians do when they're trying to be polite, but they may forget about it a bit later on or whatever. But the current position of the UK is this idea of global Britain. How do you see the idea of the special relationship, just as it were, with the US as its centerpiece, against a kind of new, free from the EU global Britain being proposed?
Well, look, the question is whether American power will continue to be and American influence will continue to be a decisive feature of world affairs. And I think it's profoundly to be hoped that it does. I'm less concerned about the special relationship between Britain and the United States than I am the special relationship between the United States and an international policy of liberal order. If that breaks down, we're really in trouble. And there are real signs that it would. Donald Trump didn't completely part with it, but he certainly had his moments. And it's interesting that, for all that he appointed Tony Blinken, he hasn't taken his advice, Biden, about Afghanistan. So I do worry that I think that the relationship between Britain and America, yes, it's true that in the briefing pack, they're always told to use the word special relationship over and over again because of its talismanic importance. But I do think there are real reasons why there is a close relationship. There's a military one, and there's a cultural one, and there's a language one. But all those things do create a special relationship. But they're more important. They're probably more special to us than they are to the United States. And I do worry that the United States will begin to lose interest in its role as a sort of international policeman, if that's a term that you would recognise, given that you know what policemen do.
Well, that's great. But I'm slightly concerned about, if we just take a single problem like Myanmar, what is the world to do with that, given that China isn't going to do anything, Russia isn't going to do anything, and the countries around aren't going to do much either?
Yeah. Look, you can't solve every problem, and we didn't. I mean, we allowed a dictatorship to govern half of Europe for almost, for 35 years after the war, and 45 years after the war. The reason we did that was a realistic view that there wasn't much that we couldn't change. And I think we have to accept that there are limits to our influence and power. We can have a concerted policy of economic pressure and political pressure, and we know that political pressure and shaming these regimes and having economic sanctions. We learn later when the regimes fall that was consequential, that it did matter, and that's why the regimes struggle against it. But we can't set as the test for that we will have achieved democracy in those countries. The most important thing is that we should retain our own confidence in our economic and social system and regard it as an example to other countries, and set ourselves the task of ensuring that it is alluring to the citizens of other countries, because that, I think, was one of the most powerful things that we did with the Soviet Union.
Well, perhaps we can then just kind of switch over to the future of the United Kingdom, because actually some very interesting things going on for us. Post-Brexit, Northern Ireland, an Irish reunification, Scotland and independence. I mean, it may be that the UK itself is going to struggle over these next few years.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I had to mute it, and there seems to be a little argument going out in the hall outside my room. That presumably wasn't. That's not about the Northern Ireland either. I think it's about homework. Yes. So we have got to ensure that we retain the unity of our own kingdom as far as we possibly can. And again, this is about demonstrating the benefits to people of that unity, and ensuring that our economic prosperity is as strong as it can be.
Yeah, but if if we look at it, it is quite conceivable that the union itself could come under huge pressure in the next 2 to 3 years. And you and I sit in the House of Lords, and somewhere there's an idea, I think, floating around about whether the future could lie in a sort of federal government at Westminster, with the other countries having much more devolved power. At the same time, the argument over Scotland is probably going to come down in the end to economics. I mean, can Scotland afford to be a separate country?
I'm not convinced that having a federal parliament will be much of a solution to the Scottish union problem. I think we should examine it on its own merits and decide that we want to do it if we think it's a good idea. It's, by the way, quite possible that it'll make it impossible to govern. And if it makes it impossible to govern, I think it would make disunity more likely rather than less. But that's a separate question. The union with Scotland, well, first of all, one of the things that people say in these referendums, they said it in Brexit, they said it in the Scottish referendum, we should talk about the positive reasons for being part of it. And as you've seen, I've already said that I think providing people with positive reasons for remaining inside some sort of union, as well as the economic union with Europe or the economic union with the United Kingdom, is important. But in these elections, you've got to also show people what the consequences are of leaving. And it's still the strongest argument to point out to the Scottish electorate the risks that leaving the United Kingdom involve. And that is still a winnable referendum. It's a very, despite the fact that I suspect the SNP will get the votes tonight that it needs in order to have a referendum, and that it will put the United Kingdom government under pressure, which actually is a pressure I think the United Kingdom government will resist, but nevertheless it will put them under that pressure. I think that if there is a referendum, there's still a very good chance independence won't win. But I think it'll only not win if people are really seized of the downsides of it, despite the fact that romantically we want to talk about the upsides of the union.
The very first discussion on devolution with Scotland failed because it didn't hit the 60% rule. I mean, is it reasonable that we could have a discussion about the ending of a 300-year relationship on a 51%, 49%?
I'm all for playing completely hardball on this. But it has to. What you have to do is be sure that in setting a rule like that, you don't create so much anger that it's actually counterproductive. So you've got to. It depends a little bit on how people in Scotland feel about it. But I think there's a good case for the threshold argument. I actually think there's a good case. I know this doesn't fly in Scotland at all, of letting Scottish people who are Scottish born vote in referendums, not just people who live there, or at least to ask the independence parties what their citizenship threshold is, and allow anyone who's eligible for citizenship to vote. And then the third thing I think you can do is to insist that they negotiate some sort of deal for independence before you have a referendum, and that will show all the downsides.
Well, as a third generation Scot, I think I can probably say I'd like to have a vote, but we'll see where that gets to. Let's move on into UK politics in party terms. You were a member of the Social Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. It was a middle ground party, which some of our younger listeners may have no understanding of. But something's happening about the fact we can't get to a middle ground party. Both Labour, under Corbyn, certainly went somewhere that a lot of people didn't want to have. We've had UKIP and all the rest of it. The Lib Dems have basically collapsed. Change UK fell apart. Do you think there's any ground for a middle space where rational argument can happen?
No. So my experience with the SDP leads me to be strongly sceptical of the ability to have a large governing party that defines itself basically as ideologically in the middle of the other two parties, because what I've realized is that political parties are demographic before they're ideological. And the problem, you've got to ask yourself the question, not what will this new party stand for, but who will it be? So in the case of the SDP, there were two different groups. Roy Jenkins, who was one of the founders, wanted to create a new Liberal Party, and David Owen wanted to create effectively a new Labour Party, a new party of the left. But David Owen's vision of what a new Labour Party would be kind of quite tough-minded on defence, on Europe, on council house sales, quite populist. What ended up happening was we ended up getting Roy Jenkins's party fighting David Owen's seats. In other words, fighting the seats in the north, the Red Bull seats, but as a new Liberal Party, and that obviously got completely crushed. So the question is, demographically, what would this new party be? Is there now a big enough professional middle class to create a political party that can get to 30–35% of the vote? Because if you can get there, then you can squeeze out one of the other parties in a two-party system where you can win lots of seats. And I've actually questioned whether that's really possible. So I have always decided, you know, once the SDP had failed, I was going to pursue my politics through trying to change one of the other parties. And that accepts that sometimes you'll be very successful, you'll be very happy with the party, which I was for most of the Cameron era, and sometimes you'll be less happy. I've got a very odd relationship with the current Conservative position. In many ways, economically, it's very moderate, right? Boris Johnson is not a small state Conservative. He does believe in infrastructure spending. He doesn't believe in cutting spending for ideological reasons. He's willing to accept that there may have to be tax cuts, and they're able to make tax increases and make that choice, all of which I approve of. But where I question the Conservative Party is whether, in a sort of attempt to appeal to a culturally conservative audience, it may become contemptuous of a lot of the liberal institutions that make the country good. And I do worry about that.
Well, let's just move on to that, shall we? I mean, one of the strange things about the Johnson emergence into the Conservative Party was the absolutely ruthless shedding of a group of Remainer Conservatives, all those that could oppose him. And I just wonder what you think at the moment about whether we've got a cabinet or we've got a court, because it does feel that this is one of the weakest cabinets in terms of individuals that we have seen for a very long time.
Yeah, I think it is actually. I would agree actually broadly that it's relatively weak. That's why I put it. I think it's a little bit overstated in this sense. What we remember from the Callaghan governments or the Blair government or indeed the Cameron government are the ministers that stood out, right? And that we can still remember now because their quality meant that we could remember them, right? But every government has a long tail of people like Albert Booth and Stan Orme that or Gavin Strang that one can hardly recall at all, right? These were not people of great independence or importance, right? However, that having been said, I think relatively speaking, it's relatively weak, not because it's a court so much, but because he reconstructed his government to ensure that he could get that he had support for the Brexit deal, and under Dominic Cummings was concerned that Boris should be able to control the cabinet, and that meant not having too many alternative poles of power. However, there are some pretty capable people as well. I would say Rishi Sunak is a notably strong Chancellor of the Exchequer. I actually don't think Dominic Raab, despite the fact that he's not completely to my taste politically, but he is a very intellectually capable Foreign Secretary, actually. I would argue that Matt Hancock and actually, rather to my surprise, Grant Shapps are quite strong Secretaries of State. But they're also, and so is Oliver Dowden, but they're also in the form of Robert Jenrick, maybe Robert Buckland, certainly, in my personal opinion, Priti Patel, are less strong.
And the Education Secretary didn't do too well.
No, look, sorry, I didn't. If I didn't mention him,
you forgot to mention.
I don't think he's got any. To be honest, I don't think he's got any place, Ian, being in the cabinet. Certainly not such a senior role. But he's a much more serious case than the others. The others are a question of relative strength. I think he's just not competent to do that job, and I think it's actually quite an indictment of the government that he's been asked to do it for so long. So I feel a bit more strongly about him.
Okay, well, let's just move to what's happening at the moment with Boris Johnson and what we have heard described as cash for curtains and so on. I mean, how serious a threat do you think this is, particularly with the Electoral Commission investigation?
Actually, of the two central investigations, it's the Standards Commissioner one that I think has got the biggest capacity to hurt him. If he, the Electoral Commissioner one, it'd probably prosecute the party rather than him. And I suspect that if they did, right, and I suspect that while that could go on for quite a long time, it might end up with an embarrassing fine, but I suspect of the two, it's less serious. The Standards Commissioner, this is a person who's already had problems with the Standards Commissioner, and there's been warned that the next time he breaks the rules, it will attract severe sanction. I don't know whether he's broken the rules, but it looks like he might have done, and actually in a relatively serious way. I know that everybody regards this as completely minor point, but he does appear that the Prime Minister received money from some people to run his personal life, not necessarily declared, right? And it may not be just the declaration, but also other aspects of his life. That is simply, if that has been what's taken place, quite serious breach of standards, but with a big S and a little s. With the electorate, this is clearly not very strong. You can see that people's response to it, I know this because I write in the Times, you can see that underneath it, people who hate Boris already, which is a lot of people, fly to, he's a liar, he's a charlatan, blah, blah, blah. But people who are either independent or don't or like him immediately say, what a stupid issue, who cares, decorated flag, I'm not paying for it, I don't care who does. Whether that will really survive the idea that if we discover that it's the case that someone else paid or tried to pay it, I just don't know. I think if he does if the Standards Commission does say, you're suspended, it does end up with a process in which he's suspended from Parliament for failing to declare donations given personally to him for his standard of living. I think that will be quite serious, but I have looked a bit naive in writing that so far, so maybe I'm wrong and it won't be that serious. I think it will be.
I suppose the question really is, there's two questions going on. The one you've just been answering is, how long will he survive? But the other question that's starting to emerge in the background is, how long does he want to stay?
Well, look, there's always been that question over. But my view is that when the Prime Ministers don't usually want to go. So the way that I do, and you can't estimate this completely, but you use a base case. And the base case of Prime Ministers quitting office because they sort of got fed up with it quite early on over money when they're under no danger is zero, right? So it would be very unusual. And I know Boris is quite unusual, but whether or not he'd really want to leave the job just after he's got there. I mean, the point I'd make is they just spent £58,000 decorating a flat. That doesn't look to me like someone who's about to leave. People used to ask me about David Cameron. Is he going to call an election? I used to say, Sam and him have just put in a kitchen. I've just been round and I've seen it. By the way, that flat in which I've been many, many times is completely nice flat. It's perfectly habitable before. I don't know why they felt they had to spend all that money on it, but that's not the decorating bill of someone who thinks they're not going to live there that long.
Well, but it might be his partner thinks she's going to live there that long. So, but look, let's not just stick with Johnson. I've got a couple of more questions, and then we'll open it up for other people to ask. I was intrigued by the fact that yesterday you wrote a column about the fact that the Labour Party was in trouble because it wasn't owning up to the real problem it's in, which is that you can blame Corbyn for everything, but actually you still haven't answered the answer about what are you going to do about the Remainers who refuse to accept the results of Brexit. And I then looked across to The Guardian and found that Raphael Bear was effectively writing the same column from a different angle. So how do you see the Labour Party?
Well, look, I think everybody can. There are certainly, surprisingly, some problems over Keir Starmer's projection and personality. Right? When I say surprisingly, I thought him really quite an imposing and impressive personality, and he's clearly got a professional life that's impressive. And he hasn't done what some other opposition leaders have done, including ones I've worked for, like William Hague, where the electorate just won't buy them. I think that's not the case with him. Nevertheless, slightly to my surprise, his personality hasn't cut through hugely, and I think he's struggling a little bit. But that's not actually the big problem that Labour has. The big problem that Labour has is demographic. Its demographic coalition isn't big enough. It appeals to a liberal metropolitan demographic, which is not a bit. It's not a sneer, because I quite like that demographic, right? And I live among it. But they appeal to that, and they do not then have a broader. That country is sort of breaking apart with other people, and the Labour Party doesn't know which way to go. In the long run, they're with the right demographic. The country's going to become more urban, it's going to become more liberal, it's going to become more diverse. But in the short term, which is where leaders have to operate, the next 4, 5, 10 years, they are trying to pitch themselves to too small a group, and they can't win elections from it. And that the significance of Hartlepool, should they lose it, is just demographic. It's not the level of support, because we know that from the national polls. It's the location of it and its nature.
I think Hartlepool will be really symbolic, but it's also slightly unfair, because there's no way that Labour would have won last time because of the UKIP vote. So the UKIP vote destroyed part of the Conservative vote, and therefore let Labour in. It's actually a pretty seriously UKIP-y area, and actually I will not be at all surprised to see Hartlepool fall to the Conservatives. Later on, just before the end, Yasmin, I hope we're going to ask Danny for his predictions for tonight, but perhaps now we should stop and ask other people to come into the conversation.
Well, thank you both very much for really wide-ranging and provocative discussion in many ways that I hope people will feel that they have questions to ask to both Daniel and Ian. I mean, while people gather their thoughts, and do be brave and put your camera on, don't just put it in the chat. I was struck by this phrase, liberal institutions which make the country good, and the idea of those institutions and their place in Britain at the moment. And of course, in Oxford, I think we'd consider Oxford University to be one of those, but also perhaps universities across the land. And I wonder if you might speak a bit about how you think the government's sort of relationship with universities is going.
Okay, so I should say at the beginning that I'm I'm the son of a pro vice chancellor and a brother of a vice chancellor, so I that makes me probably a bit biased. But I'm you know, I strongly believe that our seats of education and learning are vital to a pluralistic democracy. It drives me bananas when I hear conservatives who depend for the shaping and slow evolution of our institutions on an educated and cultured population, attacking education and culture. Where would we be without it? And that is the thing that worries me about the thrust of conservatism. The only thing I would say in its defence is not a very good thing, which is I'm not sure that the party really has its heart in it. Most of these are, after all, most of the party leadership's university educated itself. Boris studied classics at Oxford. So I'm not sure it has its heart in that particular attack, but it annoys me as a kind of flip position. And I say the same about the Supreme Court and the BBC as well.
There's a danger, Yasmin, that Daniel and I, who are supposed to be having a conversation, could just agree and hug at this point, because I absolutely agree exactly with what you're just saying. So, for goodness sake, if you just look at what's been happening in the pandemic, I mean, you'd have to say that Oxford University has had an astonishing pandemic. I mean, everything that it's been doing has been right, and it's odd that the university that was always about sort of liberal arts and politicians has been so scientifically advanced, and that it's done a terrific job.
Well, I think that will be music to everybody's ears here as well. Sophie, would you like to put your camera on and ask your question? I know you're in France, I think.
Yes, I am indeed. I'm going to try. I hope it works. I'm so sorry. Good evening. And thank you so much for, yes, good. Good evening, and thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. So I had a question about the breakup of the kingdom. Do you think there will be a second referendum on Scottish independence in the next 2 years? And what is the likely outcome?
Daniel, why don't you go?
Well, with any of these things, I don't think you could say 100%. My view is that you've helped me by saying the next 2 years. No, I think there probably won't be. So my view is that if the government can avoid holding a referendum, it will just avoid it. It doesn't want to. If the SNP were to win by itself a large majority tonight, which is a possibility, but I think not a probability, as opposed to having a coalition with the Greens, I think that the government will be in an extremely awkward position, but is quite likely still to say no to a referendum. If it were to hold a referendum and lose it, the consequences would be disastrous for it and for its leadership. Why would you do that? Right? I know that theoretically it's, well, there's a mandate and all that, but I'm not sure that they'd accept that. I think that they would just probably resist it. So I think they won't make that decision. That's what I think. And will be, it'll be some while before we have it. And you can't tell what the result will be until it's nearer. Yes. The problem with the longer you put off having it, the more young people will be a portion of the electorate, and that means that there's a demographic shift towards independence, obviously. But having another one now wouldn't settle it, so I'm not necessarily in favour of that. They just want another one.
And also,
well, from my point of view, I think it's very unlikely within 5 years. I mean, mainly because, as Daniel said earlier on, having had one and it not having succeeded, I think there are all sorts of questions hanging around what it would be. And I do think the SNP is going to have to deliver a vision of what they're actually going to do. What are they going to do economically? Are they going to have their own army? Are they going to have their own embassies? Are they going to have their own GCHQ and their own MI5? Can they possibly join the euro with the levels of debt that they've got? I mean, there's something here about, I think if the government was wise, it would say, well, we'll accept, and I'm echoing what Daniel said earlier on, we'll accept the need for a referendum, but you have to explain the case. Because if you don't explain the case and you just ask, can we be independent? You know, it's a bit like, you know, I want to be the leader. I want to be the leader. I'm the leader. What do I do now?
And as Nicola Sturgeon has not been able to show the economics of independence or the economic consequences of independence.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Sophie. There's a question from Graham Lee. Graham, would you like to ask? And do feel free to sort of introduce yourself, say who you are as well.
Oh, sure. Thanks. Well, my name's Graham Lee, and I'm a D4 student at Kellogg, actually in computer science. My question is, having sort of discussed the devolved elections and the Hartlepool election, clearly the London mayoral election is a much safer game for Labour to play, given the demographics of the city. But on the other hand, the only non-Labour candidate to win recently has been Boris Johnson on sort of broadly a platform that is not too dissimilar from Boris Johnson now. So while I'm not going to ask who you think would win that election, I am going to ask, from your sort of view on the inside, what are the tea leaves that people in the know are looking for in any change in the results in the London election?
Well, if I can begin, I think that the Conservative candidate is weak and has run a poor campaign. Sadiq Khan has been a reasonably decent mayor, and I think he's just going to romp home, because actually the demographic is for him is just there. I think what's really interesting is the mayoral elections outside London, where Birmingham may still be held by Labour, or it still be held by the Conservatives and the Teesside and so on. I think London, in a sense, is a bit of a different country, and I think it will remain Labour almost for the next 10 or 20 years, because that's just what that population will be supporting. Danny.
First of all, I just want to comment that I think that the experiment of having mayors in these places is really working, and these metro mayors are enlivening democracy. And what Ben Houchen's done in Teesside is really fascinating, reshaping the politics of the north of England, actually, and Andy Street as well. That's before coming on to the question of London. The Conservative Party has made a sort of deliberate decision. I mean, it defines itself almost as the non-London party. It's trying to build a coalition by saying we're going to effectively level out of London, even though it's being headed by somebody who was the mayor of London. So I think that is, and I'm sure Ian's right, and there's no question about it, that Labour will win heavily in London, and will carry on winning heavily, because the Conservative Party has decided it doesn't want to win in London, really. Now, my view is, in the short term, this is quite an intelligent demographic choice, which is we've got a bigger demographic than you. that's the Tory view to Labour, and you can see the strength of that in elections, right? The central politics probably is a more socially conservative than me, and probably about where I am economically, and the Conservative Party can win from that position, right? It's a mistake to think of it as incredibly right-wing government. It isn't. It's just centred in non-London demographic. But the problem is that, in my view, if the Conservative Party is going to make a success of its policy of levelling up, it'll make more places like London. More young people will stay in them. They'll become more socially liberal. They'll become more like university towns, and the Conservative Party will begin to lose everywhere. The argument there, though, is the Conservative Party has shown in the past that what it does in those circumstances is loses for 10 years and reappears changed. So maybe it feels it can afford to make the short-term decision because it doesn't have ideological barriers to shifting quite a lot.
Great. I've got a question from Stephen Parisian.
Thanks, Yasmin. Afternoon, everyone. I'm Steve Parisian. I'm a departmental lecturer here at Continuing Education, a fellow of the college. Can I ask you, Danny? Well, both really. Just going on from your last point, Danny. If Boris falls due to whatever, whether it's prejudice about the money for his flat or whatever, what happens to the Tories then, and who would be the next leader?
Well, look, we're piling a lot of ifs, right? The Prime Minister, so I should say that to start off with. Although I do think what's happening over the flat and the Commission, the Standards Commissioner, is quite serious for technical reasons. He retains a lot of political strength. He has 10 points ahead in the YouGov poll this morning. He may be about to gain rather than lose a seat in a by-election. Hold on, win in West Midlands and win in Teesside. That is quite a strong position to be in, right? Meanwhile, Keir Starmer will come under a lot of criticism. So he will come into this standards problem very strong. And it may be that whatever the technicalities of it, he's able to survive. The question of who succeeds him will depend to some extent on how the main players respond to any trouble that Boris got into. We'd be assuming that he fell after a controversy in which members of the cabinet would be sort of required to give their view about whether he should stay or not. That's quite a difficult decision. What do you do if you're Rishi Sunak and the TV comes to you and says, the Prime Minister's just been suspended from Parliament for a month. Do you think he should resign? Right? And are you going to say, I'm going to stand by him, or not going to stand by him? Then he resigns. What position are you in then? So it's there are a lot of choices ahead for them. But my view is, if the Prime Minister did fall in a sort of accident of this kind quite soon, probably Rishi will be the Prime Minister. I think Rishi is a person of great integrity and ability. I think there's a question mark over whether he's got the same breadth of appeal as Boris. Few people have. He is definitely more ideologically free market than Boris is. If given his own head, would he make the same pragmatic political decisions? So that is the choice ahead of him.
Do you think, sorry, Danny, just a quick, sorry, Lord Blair, I'm interrupting.
No, I was just going to say, I think the only bit I disagree with, well, I wouldn't disagree, I just sort of question what Danny's just said is, I think the idea of a Prime Minister being suspended from Parliament is actually so shocking that might have a different effect.
It's possible, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's possible or impossible.
It's quite possible.
It is quite possible.
That's what I keep saying to everyone. It's quite possible.
Yeah, but it's quite possible. But the idea that it happens and he continues to be the Prime Minister takes us into places. I mean, Ken Livingstone got suspended when he was the mayor. But I mean, the mayor of London's one thing, the Prime Minister another thing. I mean, it's a bit like, is it okay for Netanyahu to continue while he's being prosecuted? I mean, there are limits to this. And French presidents and other things, I personally think that the action of suspending the Prime Minister from Parliament would be a bit of a watershed.
Yeah, I think it would be. The reason I'm raising it is, remarkable though it sounds, it's got to be a possibility, and it might not happen. And the only reason one might say it wouldn't happen is because it's so shocking. But apart from that, maybe it'll turn out that he hasn't broken the rules, or he hasn't broken them so seriously they demand that sanction, or they pull back from proposing that sanction. That is a possibility as well. But I just think it's something that might happen.
And if it does, presumably, then we might end up like in 1990 with Margaret Thatcher, a queue of cabinet ministers saying you need to go in that eventuality.
Possible.
Yeah, but not this lot. This lot of
well, I'm not sure, because Ian, the only thing I would say there is they're not, I think, actually all personally that loyal to Boris. So the truth about Boris is quite a loner. And David Cameron always used to say to me, I think I'm one of Boris's few friends, and he's not, and we're not that friendly, is that, and I think it's true about Boris. I don't know, if you ask me who is Boris's close friends, you wouldn't know who that was necessarily. And it's certainly not inside the government. Who is his personal close ally inside the government? I don't know who that is. Ben Wallace, maybe.
I think you might have already touched on this, but Rebecca is asking that she'd be really interested to know what Daniel's prediction is for today's election. So let's hear it.
So, first of all, what I really should do is give you percentage chances. That's going to take us too long, but I should give you percentage chances. Nothing is 100% chance. And if even everything that I suggested to you, and this is not the case, had a 95% chance, by the time you multiply all the prediction I'm about to make together, you'd find that there's a very large chance that one of them will be wrong. I should say that. So I am doing this in a very, very rough and dirty way, which I don't really approve of. Sadiq Khan, with a very high level of probability, will win the London mayoralty. The Conservatives, with a high but not super high probability, will win. Sort of 70%, 75% probability will win in Hartlepool. Maybe 80% chance. The Scottish nationalists will end up being the governing party in Scotland with a very high probability. With a pretty high probability, they will. I would say that it's about 50-50 whether they get a majority or not by themselves. But it's a very high probability that they get a majority with the Greens to make independence and to continue governing. The Welsh Labour Party will be the largest party in Wales by enough to be able to govern. That's with a high degree of probability. Andy Street will win the West Midlands, but I would say that only with a 65% probability, possibly 70%, but it's a bit closer, 70% maybe. Ben Houchen will win in Teesside. The Labour Party will make a small number of gains in council elections, but it will be regarded as disappointing.
So I should say, people, you've got about 3.5 hours if you haven't voted to get out there and make sure you do vote. You've heard it here. Well, I mean, my final question really would be, please would you come and have dinner in college as soon as we're fully functioning and opening, because we'd really love to host you properly and have you as guests at Kellogg College and continue this conversation. So we'd really
okay, well that would be delightful. I just wanted to congratulate the college on its 30 years, and just we all live through difficult times, but used to be called Rewley House, and Rewley is quite an interesting name, which Danny may not recognise. but the fact is that difficult times can lead to good times or good outcomes, because Rewley is named after Rewley Abbey, which sits where the grounds, its ruins are under the grounds of the Side Business School now. But when Rewley was dissolved by Henry VIII, its library was so extensive that it was the foundation of the Bodleian Library. So things can happen that are
amazing,
are interesting. So I'm an optimist, and I really do hope that Kellogg goes well.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you on behalf of all of our audience. And I think certainly seen how the House of Lords is a space for moderation and debate and critical discussion. So thank you very much, and we really appreciate having you here this evening, and thank you to everybody who's come to listen. So this is one in a series of conversations which Kellogg is having with a number of people in public life, and there's more on the programme. So do come again to our events. So thank you.
Can I just thank Ian, Lord Blair, for doing that in conversation. It was a particularly attractive invitation to me to have a chance to have a public dialogue with him, as I admire him very much.
Oh, that's a bit harsh. Well, I admire you very much, so that's fine. So we'll have a group hug.
Carry on. Sorry, Yasmin.
No, that's great. Well, thank you, and don't stay up too late. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.